Welcome to the Classical Commons Podcast. This is a conversation exploring the ideas, people, the trends in classical education. I'm Rob Jackson, the founder of this digital platform. Today's guest is a colleague and friend, Robert Pondiscio, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on K-12 education, curriculum, and all kinds of good stuff. You were at Fordham for a while, Robert. You have been an advisor to Core Knowledge, the Foundation, Democracy Prep. Your most recent book, How the Other Half Lives, focused on Success Academy, charter schools.
Well, I wish I'd written. I wish I'd written How the Other Half Lives. That was.
I said lives. It learns.
Right. How the Other Half learns. But for what it's worth, apropos of classical education, almost no one got the illusion like that. It was a deliberate allusion to Reese, and no one got the reference. Yeah.
Well, anyhow, we're just really happy to have you here, Robert.
Thanks.
The cause of the day, the thing that we would like to talk about is a report. But before we get to that, I'd like to know a little bit more about how you, one who has both taught and obviously been involved in ed reform, got interested initially in classical education.
Oh, in classical education. Wow. That's a great question because I got to say, I'm not sure I can pinpoint the moment where I became aware that there were these things out there called classical schools. And this really betrays everything about me being a so-called AEI scholar. I always feel the need to make air quotes when somebody calls me a scholar because my own, transition into the world of education was impressionistic, I guess would be a word. I was a mid-career teacher, signed up for a 2-year alt-cert program in New York City more than 20 years ago. And it was going to be my 2-year mid-career public service, do-gooder stint. It was not supposed to turn into a second career. And then I got interested in issues of, curriculum and instruction and whatnot. And, and mostly I've had a second career because it turns out the education reform movement that you alluded to earlier didn't seem all that interested in that. And as a former teacher, that was all I was interested in. And it was kind of, a mystery to me then and now, like, wait a minute, you think you're going to change outcomes by just pulling policy levers? Really? That's not going to work. You gotta, it's about what kids do all day. Sure. But I guess, at some point, it occurred to me, looking at the charter school scene in Florida, that every time somebody opened a classical charter school, there was a line out the door, metaphorically speaking, the next day. I could intuit what classical schools were. And now that I'm saying this, it occurs to me also, there's a very successful chain of classical schools, charters in New York City, run by Lester Long, the Bronx Classical School. So I was probably aware of them and got to know Lester as well. But I was mostly fascinated by the fact that parents were signing up for these classical charter schools in Florida and elsewhere, almost without knowing why. In other words, they sort of like, you had me at Play-Doh, right? They probably didn't know exactly what they were signing up for, but probably, I intuited, it was just a creeping dissatisfaction with, hey, whatever we're doing right now in my kid's school, it's not working. Hey, what's this thing called classical education? And it was no more, of an observation than that. Just noticing just the burgeoning demand for this got me interested in looking at the sector. And Thales Academy is another one. I spent some time down there. I visited some of their schools over the years. So it doesn't take long, or it doesn't take many visits to classical schools, whether they're private or charter. And to compare and contrast that with one's own experience, if it's like mine, teaching, in high poverty settings in places like the South Bronx, to realize, hey, there's this really meaty, nourishing thing, and man, I wish I'd had that when I was a kid. And hey, I might be interested in having that as a teacher as well.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Yeah, it's a heck of a good model. And the other thing too, I guess, to complete the circle, is when I worked at the Core Knowledge Foundation, there were no small number of classical schools that were core knowledge K-5 or K-8, and then classical in high school as well.
Sure.
So somehow over the years, I became aware of these things out there that were not only in high demand, but were very successful.
So you mentioned a few, Thales and some others that you have visited. You're an author, and you do have a pretty good eye. I've read a good bit of what you have put out, and the revealing detail seems to be one of your strong suits. You pull that out
Hmm.
and you see how these things work, and you sort of expand or exposit from that.
Well,
What
thanks.
is in those schools that you have visited that really sets them apart? If you try to characterize the classical model.
Yeah, I'm not. I don't want to pretend even for a nanosecond to be anything like an expert on the classical model. Of even despite your kind words, having much of a discerning eye for it. But I recognize a solid, nourishing curriculum when I see one,
Mhm.
and that's kind of my thing, as it were.
Yep.
I alluded to core knowledge a few moments ago. Um, I've told the story countless times about kind of stumbling upon E.D. Hirsch Jr.'s work when I was teaching at a low performing public school in the South Bronx, and just being shocked by it and thinking, "Hey, wait a minute, why aren't we doing this? This is exactly what kids need." And being told, "Oh, that's that dead white guy stuff. Nobody takes that seriously." And then being like surprised, like, "Wait a minute. So clearly you haven't read Hirsch because his work has nothing to do with dead white guys. It's about background knowledge. It's about
Mhm.
vocabulary." But Hirsch's work opened my eyes to the need for a knowledge-rich curriculum. For if you want to dismiss it as dead white guys, that's fine. But look, that's how language proficiency works. There's a certain body of knowledge, and including authors and classical references, biblical references, and whatnot, that literate people have, and they assume literate writers and speakers use and assume their audiences know, and if they don't, it goes over their heads. So even before I knew what classical was, the ground had been softened,
Mm.
Rob, by my interest and advocacy for Hirsch's work.
Yeah, and cultural literacy just sort of makes sense. I often wonder why there's such a almost visceral reaction to the notion that these are things that we share in common. It's a part of our language. Literally, it's baked in, and you just need to know it. Whether
That's right.
whether you're drawn to it, whether you love it, whether you're averse, just know of it so that you can enter the conversation. Right?
Yeah, look, even when I worked for the Core Knowledge Foundation, and I would give talks about literacy, I would take great care to not turn my talks into, a marketing pitch, as it were,
Yeah.
for core knowledge. Instead, I would talk about how language proficiency works, how, again, as I said a moment ago, the way language works is that literate speakers and writers make assumptions about what their audiences know, and when those assumptions are correct, language or communications is fluid. When they aren't, it falls apart. And I would have any number of demonstrations
Sure.
of this, and I would often talk to audiences of teachers like the ones I had been, who were working in high poverty areas, who were working exclusively or almost exclusively with low income Black and brown students. And I would point out, that look, whether you like it or not, this is how language works, and this is what we can't decide what it is that kids need to know. Language is kind of like a river that chooses its own banks, and so if you decide, oh, you don't, kids don't need to learn, Greek and Roman myth, they don't need to know anything about biblical literacy or whatnot. You're making a decision, a high stakes decision,
Mhm.
on behalf of other people's children that could have enormous consequences.
Yeah.
From memory, there was a terrific piece, and I would talk about this often, still do, that Mark Bauerlein wrote for the Chronicle of Higher Ed some years ago, where he kind of created a word picture of imagine a kid with a Black kid who's interviewing for a job at a law firm, I think was the conceit, and he'd gone through to great schools, and he had got good grades, and somebody makes a reference to, I think it was Achilles' heel or something like that,
Mhm.
and the kid goes, "Huh, what's that?" And the partners make a note, the way Mark described it, basically, "Oh, I thought this kid was smart, but he doesn't know something very basic, huh?"
Mm.
So in other words, my what I would preach to teachers about this is, you're making a high stakes decision, and someday these students are going to leave us, and the rest of the world is not as prepared as we might be to give them the benefit of the doubt, to
Mhm.
judge them kindly. So,
Mhm.
and to put it even more boldly, if you don't ensure that they have this grounding, this body of knowledge, of mental furniture that everybody else will assume they have, you're almost imposing a form of illiteracy on them.
Yeah.
You know, you're saying, hey, I know this, but you don't need to know this because pick your reason. It's not culturally relevant. It's Eurocentric. It's white supremacist. It's whatever. To boil it down, sorry, you got me on my soapbox here a little bit, Rob. There are two things we could do as educators. We can prepare the child for the world, or we can change the world for the child. Both of those are hard to do. One of them is a lot harder than the other.
A lot harder.
Yeah. But that's
Maybe
what we do, right? In other words,
Yeah,
some of our fashionable notions that are not classical make assumptions about what children, frankly, arrogant assumptions about what children do and do not need to know. And I'm not saying they're done out of arrogance. They're done often with every good intention. We're going to make this child-centered. We're going to, let the child decide what he or she wants to learn, and that's going to light the fire of imagination and ambition and set them off and running. Isn't it pretty to think so? It's nice when it works, but you may be sending children off into the world less than fully prepared and at a disadvantage.
Indeed. Well, you mentioned that Achilles heel, so that's a nice transition, just coincidentally, perhaps. You and your colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute recently published, and I'm going to go ahead and put this on our screen, The Achilles Heel of Classical Education. So I'd like to talk a little bit with you about the findings of this report, and maybe you can just give us the backstory. In other words, what prompted you and the team to go after this particular subject, which is fundamentally about whether classical education and its growth can continue apace if we don't have the faculty that we need. So,
well, look, you have forgotten more about this than I will pretend to know. But to me, it's a rather obvious point, which is you look at the incredible demand and the burgeoning growth of this sector. Terrific schools. I alluded before, every other day it felt like a new Florida charter school, classical charter school was opening up, and at some point you have to ask yourself, hey, wait a minute. Who's going to teach in these schools? I certainly did not have anything like the grounding I would need to be successful as a teacher in a classical school. And one assumes, given what I know about formal teacher prep programs, ed schools, they're sure as heck not preparing teachers to teach in this model. So who is? And I remember also when I was at the Core Knowledge Foundation, one of our kind of flagship schools, as it were, that we would send people to look at was TJ, Thomas Jefferson in North Carolina.
Yep.
And I remember Jeff Ziegler, the then head of school, giving this terrific speech at one of our conferences on the theme of you can't give what you don't have. In other words, if you don't have this grounding yourself, then how are you going to be successful at teaching it? Bottom line, Rob, it just seemed like an obvious speed limit to the sector. Like at some point, you've got to make a decision, right? Who's going to teach in these schools, and what are you going to do if you can't find classically trained educators? I mean, we all know the what pipeline exists, right? It's Hillsdale, it's St. John's, it's University of Dallas, but I mean, the number of teachers coming out of those programs, they could probably fit on a Greyhound bus, in a given year. Like there's just not that damn many of them.
Right.
And they all flock to Hillsdale, and I think they literally outnumber, the candidates, the recruiters outnumber the candidates on career day.
That job fair. That's right.
So that's not, as they say, that dog won't hunt. So where's it going to come from? And to give props to my colleague, Annika Hernandez, this idea had been brewing in the back of my mind. Oh, I should really do something on this at some point. And then Annika was hired a couple of years ago, and she had been a Great Hearts teacher. And so I sunk my hooks into her on day one saying, oh, do I have a project for you? Because she has experience in this. She came through Notre Dame. She's taught in this model, and she's again a lot more experience in this than I am. I had an intuition about this. She had some real like you do, some real knowledge of the sector. That's right.
Yeah, she's done a fine job. The team, the authors did a fine job in outlining and characterizing what is required of a teacher to really be suitable for these schools. And it does have to do with their training, that they have a content depth and awareness and mastery, that they are committed to the formation of the child, not just intellectually, but morally, right? So that there's a school culture, right? That is, it's the atmosphere, it's the air we breathe, and it runs oftentimes counter, right, to the mainstream or to
Oh,
the
not oftentimes, diametrically. I
yeah,
mean,
without question.
and again, I reflect on my own teacher training, and it was not up for discussion that education must be student centered.
Mm,
And I remember I was look, the blessing of my teaching career, as brief as it was. I was in the classroom full time for 5 years and part time for several years after that, while I sashayed into the ed policy world. But I remember so clearly, because I was in my 40s when I started teaching, not in my 20s. I was able, I think, to bring I'm not going to say a discerning eye, but a certain skepticism, to
yeah, yeah,
bear
yeah, sure.
at the work where that I would not have had the courage to pursue at age 22. So for example, I remember an AP of mine, my one year, described me as an authoritarian teacher, and I'm sure she was thinking to insult me, and I did not take it as an insult. I said, thank you. It's like, in other words, yeah, I'm the adult in the room. They are children, I don't want to say I'm not interested. That sounds arrogant, but I'm not just the tallest person in the room. I'm supposed to be the most knowledgeable one, and the one who runs the room.
That's right.
Um,
That's right.
and to make the obvious point, that notion is not controversial in the classical
It's
world,
not.
but it
It's
it
not.
makes you a bit of an outlier when you are traditionally trained.
It does too often. This notion of the sage on the stage. That's a
Yeah,
pejorative phrase, right? To be found
yeah,
in many ed schools. Uh,
yeah,
that's a point of pride. If you're applying
and
to
it
a
should be.
classical school, say I'm up for that. I may have a
Yeah,
little bit
yeah,
of
yeah.
ways to go, but I'd like to be a sage up there
Oh, no,
as
no
I need to be.
question, no question. And my favorite line in the report, I think it was, I can't remember who said it, that so many teachers who come out of the so-called refugee teachers who the classical schools sometimes hire from the public school system. This person said some of them are like, I had no idea a school like this existed.
Mm,
Because where do you see that? If the water in which you swim is constructivist this and child-centered that, and even if you didn't have a classical education yourself as a kid, if you had that, call it what used to be traditional model of the teacher's in front of the room in the big desk and is leading the room, and is the authority figure, then that's what you're expecting school to feel like, right?
That's right. That's right. I've interviewed any number of individuals who are refugee types coming over, who are old enough to remember when the
Yeah,
classroom, even in their town or in their burg, was still run by that sage up front,
yeah.
and they've imbibed that. Right, that's been their mantra, and somehow they survived. And once they discovered the classical schools, they are
Five
just
five
all
thousand years of teachers leading discussion. We must have been that way for a reason, right? They must have
indeed,
known
indeed.
something under that olive tree
That's
back in
right.
ancient Greece.
Well, the report also does justice to the growing movement within higher education to provide support. There are now undergraduate programs, even
Yeah.
and minors and majors, to launch teachers into the classical vein. And then there are a number of grad programs, some of which I've been actively involved in because of my work previously with Great Hearts Academies. And so you can see that there is within higher ed at least recognition that this is a new market, and we want to
Yeah.
serve that. I wonder if you have any observations or if your team really picked up on any of the distinctives of those programs and why it is that they aren't growing outside of what looks like primarily private, maybe mostly religious institutions of higher education. Why don't we have this happening in our state schools, in our state
I'd like to
universities?
turn that question around and have you answer it, to be
Okay.
perfectly honest, because I'd love your observations, because your intuition or the way you teed that question up feels to me like the intuitive answer, like you want to, for if you're a higher ed prep program, whether you're public or private, you probably want to go where the market is leading you, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's not necessarily what we're seeing. So you tell me. I mean,
Yeah.
I have a bias here, which I'll indulge in a second, but I want to hear what the correct answer is
Sure.
from you first. Why aren't universities? I mean, because yes, you're right. There are some, call them boutique programs, cropping up. but even so, they will not be able to meet more than a tiny fraction of the foreseeable demand for not just teachers but administrators in classical schools.
Yeah. Well, the most recent estimates in terms of the number of classical schools out there, 1,500 or more. And this, again, was produced a couple of years ago when Arcadia Education took kind of a sliver of this and extrapolated from it. It looks like we're talking about 2/3, maybe 3/4 of those schools are religious, have a religious identity. So now they actually serve probably about half the population, the other half being served by public charter schools, because public classical charter schools, like the ones you mentioned, can open and be sustainable at much larger numbers, right? Much larger enrollment. And as such, it seems like those institutions of higher education that have taken an interest are primarily connected to or somehow serving that market from within the community of the associations of primarily Christian classical education. That being said, I've seen those institutions, I've worked with them, and they recognize the growing charter movement and want to build and shape their programs in ways that will not be off-putting, right, to sort of a member of the secular community, as it were, someone who doesn't necessarily share their religious convictions, but who wants to understand the tradition and wants to convey that to their students. And so it's really been an interesting balancing act to watch what I would say in the last 40 years, this renewal recovery movement come out of religious circles, but then eventually be adopted by and taken up in a secular model, namely the charter model. And thus, those who have served these schools, the religious schools, are beginning to diversify their approach and trying to understand, well, how do we serve our communities, that have doctrine and so forth, and we want to be attentive to that. But how do we serve these growing number of communities where they're looking to put a charter in place and they don't need, right? They don't need anything to block that. They just need to go deeper into the tradition. So it's a really fascinating phenomena where, as we saw in the early days of the colonies and the Republic, the public-private partnership is alive and well in classical education, right? It's not this harsh distinction. And so to the question that I kind of led you with, I think that our state universities are primarily under the influence of what you have characterized primarily as a kind of progressive approach.
Sure.
And as such, they just don't know this is there. Or if they know it's there, it's not big enough for them to worry about, because they have, as you like to say, right, they've got 80% of the student population to serve, right? The teachers that go out into the public district schools, and that's their mainstay. That's where they're going to spend their time and energy.
And can we agree that there's probably, I'm not a teacher basher, and I don't want to be a ed school professor basher either, but can we also, I don't think it's controversial, we can agree that there's a little bit of a anti-classical bias, right? In other words,
I think that's true, right? I mean,
right? I'm trying to be mild about it, but that's kind of a fair thing to say, right? Like, Paulo Freire and Plato are not, you're not, it's one or the other. You're kind of, you're cut from very, very different cloths there.
Just yesterday, anecdotally, I'm on the Zoom call with a graduate student in, I'll just say, Middle America, whose professor taught a history and philosophy course that was just steeped in the classical tradition. I've gotten to know him pretty well. And of course, she, following in his footsteps, is now all about her research, her proposal, the dissertation she's going to defend on Saturday is all about the growth of classical education. So she's found the space there, right? And I asked her, so your professor, how likely was it that you would bump into him there at State University, right? And she said, I was just really lucky. I mean, I was really lucky, because I would have gone completely all in the other direction had I not met him. And then she said, and this was funny, she kind of leaned into the camera and said, listen, we have to be careful what I'm saying here. I am in the School of Ed, right? So I don't know. There's something there, something of the animus that you're describing. However, I would like to see us get past that. Like, if I had my druthers, how do we actually begin to get that conversation going with our ed school brethren?
When you said how do you get the conversation going, I was with you when you completed the sentence by saying with our ed school brothers. It's like, that's a different question.
How do we take this classical right into the state university?
Let me give you an earnest answer. Okay, I have evolved in my thinking over 25 years and become much more of a school choice guy. It's not that I wasn't a school choice guy when I started teaching at PS 277 in the Bronx, 25 years ago. I just didn't know what school choice was. And I've said
Yeah.
this 1,000 times. Like if you'd said to me as a young person, what's private school? I would have thought you meant Catholic schools. If you said to me, what's boarding school? I would have asked, what'd you do that your dad wanted to send you away? And because, I simply did not know that there was anything other than this is where I live. That's where I go to school. That was just the dominant model, as it is in this country. It has been for generations. So I became a school choice advocate, frankly, as I became a curriculum advocate, as I got interested in the work of E.D. Hirsch Jr. And others. I was alluding to before about how, it was a wonder to me that the education reform movement seemed to be agnostic about curriculum, when to me, I was passionate about it. And it didn't take long for me to figure out that, look, if you really want to advance any model, core knowledge, classical, project-based learning, micro school, whatever it is, all roads lead to school choice, right? Because even though you and I might be, fans of the classical model or core knowledge or whatnot, how do you feel about saying, well, this must be the default and every child must have this, right? That's a different conversation. Now, as soon as I say that, of course, the public school system takes extraordinary liberties, uncontroversially, in adopting curricula and pedagogy without, and much oversight whatsoever. But in a sane world that had sophisticated views of different curricula and different models, it would be kind of obvious that you would no more accept a world in which there was one school that got to choose its model than you would accept one restaurant that got to choose what you got to eat every day.
Sure. Yep.
There's just too much variety to make these decisions on behalf of other people's children. And also, if you want this model, and whatever your particular favorite flavor happens to be, if you want it to be fruitful and nourishing, well, it needs to be administered and taught by people who are on board with it.
Sure.
My most controversial opinion about education, Rob, I've said this for years, and it offends my fellow curriculum advocates when I say this. I would rather my child's teacher be a Kool-Aid swilling, disciple of a curriculum that I cannot stand than be forced to do something that I like at gunpoint, and do it resentfully or, in a half-hearted way. You'd probably get better results with the passionate teacher who's completely devoted to something, even if it's something that you don't like.
Yeah.
I'm nattering on, but you get the point. In other words, in my vision of choice, it's not, public schools are terrible, demand choice. It's, hey, look, your public school might be fine, but there's a lot. What was the line from Hamlet? There's more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio.
Right.
Well, there's more, there's a lot more models out there than, frankly, school choice advocates seem to sometimes understand.
Yep. Oh, I agree.
And if you want those models to be chosen thoughtfully and delivered effectively, well, then you have to create the conditions that allow for that. So this is a long way of getting to your question. How are we going to soften the ground among ed schools? Well, I'm not going to live to see this day. You might. You're younger than I am. But let's look to ESA states like Texas and Florida, principally because they're large, not because other ESA states don't matter, but the conditions are now being created to exactly have that, that variety of models. And it's just a matter of time before schools of education have to prepare professionals to be successful in those models. So I suspect, and then now let me make a joke on myself. What do I do in a think tank? I always say what my real job description is. I try to talk things into existence. So I'm trying to talk this into existence. But I earnestly believe that it will take time. It's not going to be you pass ESAs on Monday and suddenly you get great classical schools on Tuesday afternoon. But I think in time, we will start to, it's inevitable that we will gain an appreciation for these different models, and just axiomatically, just preparation for success in different models requires a more sophisticated lens on those models in the institutions that prepare teachers.
That's right. Yeah, I'm working now as a research fellow with the Flagler College, and so I get sort of a front row seat. They have an institute there to support classical education. There's some coursework in the making right now that will provide an alternative certification path, right, for these schools and their teachers.
And as those teachers and graduates are successful, other institutions will like what I was jokingly called the "When Harry Met Sally" model. I'll have what she's having.
Yeah,
If
that's
you're
right.
if you're
That's
if
exactly
you're
right.
churning out graduates who are killing it in their schools, and then other schools will be the path to your door to see how you're doing it.
That's right. It's going to take time, but
Of
you're right.
course.
We've got to wedge in there, and we've got to demonstrate that this is the path forward. I love the variety that you're suggesting, because what you and I both know is that ed schools generally don't provide that. Plenty of research has been done over the past 2-3 decades now. I'm thinking back to Steiner's analysis of curriculum back 20 years ago now, right? And it was
David
almost
Steiner, yes.
boilerplate stuff, right? David
Yep.
Steiner, that's right.
Yep.
And Ashley Berner. And I just thought, why, and how did it happen, right? Again, we don't have to go down that story, that storied history, but I'm really, really concerned that we've got to somehow break up that monopoly, because that's what it feels like to me. And what I hear you suggesting is, with some choice, and with some choices that may be able to sort of inch their way in.
Well, at some point, right, it has to embarrass ed schools that the research shows that they have no impact, right? Again, I'm not trying to be unkind here, but am I not correct to say that the only thing that an education master's degree has been shown to raise is the teacher's salary, right? It doesn't, there's no cause and effect relationship that I believe anybody's been able to discover between having that credential and student achievement.
Yeah.
So if you're not preparing teachers for that, and I'm not a testing hawk, but I mean, I pay attention to these things. If you're not preparing teachers to succeed in schools, then what are you doing?
Yeah.
And look, you probably could cite data on this. I don't have it, but I'll bet it exists. If the majority of schools out there that are classical schools are classical Christian schools, then correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, they don't need to have credentialed teachers at all.
That's right.
Right?
No, they don't. That's
so,
right. That's correct.
And it strikes me that they're still getting pretty good outcomes. So what does that
They
tell
are
you?
indeed. They are indeed.
Okay.
I think on a future podcast, we need to walk through what our ideal grad program would be, right? Because again, I'd love to see a total revamp of graduate training. And we've got a couple of them out there, and they're cited in your report, but a total revamp of graduate education degrees that are focused on the classical form, because they're going to be content rich. They're going to be drawing on a tradition. And I hope, pray God, they're going to have a lot of the science of learning and reading in there, because I think that's just all in our favor. And they're going to be about a pedagogy that's effective, right? Because it's drawn from the very nature of the subject matter. So we can talk about that later. We've got to get through this report of yours in the next couple of minutes. Now, okay, the report basically said this is the limiting factor. You don't have enough faculty to keep the growth rate up. And so by the time your team concluded, you said, well, here are some pathways. Here are some possibilities for increasing that size of that pipeline, or the volume there. You had expanding fellowships and apprenticeships to kind of bring more in, community outreach. You said we should develop strategic partnerships. You went down the list, but I'd like you to sort of prioritize for us and for our audience, what are the top 3 things that we should be doing in these schools to get that pipeline flowing? This is local stuff. These are local schools, right? And they need to somehow tap into it for their own sake.
Yeah, I really believe that the most the lowest hanging fruit and the most robust orchard, to beat that metaphor to the ground, is the so-called refugee teacher, which is a phrase that's not original to me. It came up in the process of our report that some schools, this one headmaster, I think it was Michael Rose, described hiring refugee teachers. And I just love the phrase, because now that when I think about my own teaching and my own experience teaching public schools, had I known that there was such a thing as a classical school where I could be the unabashed sage on the stage and I could teach the core knowledge curriculum, for example, I would have left tire tracks on the backs of everybody, around me to get to that school and beg for a job. And I can't be alone in that. Right. There are any number, and the quote in the report was, the teacher saying they had no idea that schools like this existed. But they do. They're out there, and call it old school, call it whatever you want, whatever pejorative you want to throw at it. There's a lot of us who still adhere to that idea, or that ideal, that look, we're the adults. Here's what you need to know to be not just a successful person, but a well-educated person, a virtuous person, etc. That we have a role to play in terms of shaping your character. And some of us, once we find out that model is there, would be like, oh, hell yeah, that's
Sign
Please
me up.
sign
Yeah,
me up.
yeah, that's right.
So I have to believe there's what 3.7 million teachers,
Mhm.
currently full-time teachers in I think in just the public schools in this country. Surely there are a non-trivial number of those teachers who, if they have the opportunity to take what their love of learning and their love of kids and their desire to do what's best for kids, but are already congenitally, so to speak, predisposed toward this model. I don't think it should be that hard. Well, I take it back. There's going to be some transition issues which we can talk about, but I think that's just the most fruitful vein of ore is disaffected public school teachers, because this is, for a lot of us, this is what school is supposed to be and how it's supposed to feel.
Yeah. When I was talking to that grad student, right, and she described just how pivotal that one course, again, it was a history, philosophy of education
Yeah,
course that just set the trajectory of her life. And she was teaching, she taught at the secondary level, she taught social studies, and she was so fascinated by history that once she got into the history of education, she couldn't let go. And
yeah,
she felt hoodwinked, quite honestly. She felt as though she'd been deceived, right?
yeah.
Because no one had told her about this 2,500 years of precedent in the tradition. But I mention that because I'm wondering if we couldn't set up some outposts with professors like that, right? If we could find
Yeah.
him and know that they're going to be directing the next generation,
Well, some
maybe
do.
establishing some discontents for sure.
Yeah. No, some do, and I think we talked about this in our report about one of the strategies is to identify not just departments but like-minded professors
Yeah,
who especially like this would be hard for a Great Heart, say, where you used to work, that's hiring I don't know what the number is, but many dozens of teachers a
hundreds. Yeah,
year.
sure,
Yeah,
sure.
probably hundreds. If you are a local small classical school and you may have 2 or 3 openings, well, then it might make sense to have a relationship with that professor to
Mhm.
say, hey, we have this teacher who speaks volumes of you. Do you have any more students like that one?
That's right. Yeah,
So these small informal networks can pay dividends as well.
yeah, without question. As the report, we should actually touch on the idea of transitioning, right? So if we find these refugees who are in their discontent, happy to come over towards the classical model, into the classical model, what are some of the things that your team discovered would be necessary to help them make that transition?
Well, I mean, one, there might be some habits to unlearn. Like if the proverbial fish that doesn't know what's in water, if you don't know that there's another model other than student-centered, constructivist, progressive education, then even if the model is appealing, you might have brought some bad habits with you, that
Sure.
have to be unlearned. And look, the steepest one is probably being a content expert,
Mm,
and really knowing your subject well. I mean, I've written volumes over the years, and I don't want to bore anybody with the kind of the skills focused ideas that we have about education. Like the reason I became an E.D. Hirsch disciple is because he's right about one big thing, which is that skills are domain specific. In other
yeah,
words,
that's right.
so we have these ideas in the traditional school. I shouldn't say traditional, because classical really is traditional, right?
Is
In
the
the
tradition. That's right.
common school world,
Yep.
that we can impart things like critical thinking and problem solving and communications and creativity and whatnot. Well, you can't. Those are what a cognitive scientist would call domain specific. You
Mhm.
can problem solve about an area that you know a lot about. You cannot be an all-purpose problem solver.
Mhm.
But if you bring that idea with you, from the common school world to the classical school world, you might struggle. If you have never developed a subject discipline except pedagogy, if that's your field, then you're going to struggle, because we're not focused on pedagogy here. We're not dismissive of it, but you need to be an expert in the hard sciences, in history,
That's right.
etc. You got to know your stuff.
Yep.
You can't just it's not discovery learning, right? It's not
Right. That's right.
problem based education. You
That's
have
right.
to be, if you're going to be the sage on the stage, you got to be the sage, right?
You got to be a wise one. That's right.
You
That's
got to
indeed.
start with knowing what you're talking about.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
you can't assume that even if a teacher has recognizes a rich school culture and wants to be part of it, that doesn't mean that they have the intellectual preparation to be
Yeah.
successful on day one.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, and the one piece that I didn't see referenced in your report, which I would love to see somebody pursue in earnest in the future, is the potential for those golden handcuffs, right? If a teacher's been working in a district setting and they are a part of the system and they're vested and so forth, they might very well want to come over to a classical school, but find that the financial incentives are just not there, right? The remuneration is not sufficient.
Yeah.
Is anybody touching on this, especially as it relates to classical? Again, it's probably too small ball, but
I'm not sure that's a solvable problem, Rob. I mean,
yeah.
I think of some of my former colleagues in the New York City Department of Education, where everybody could probably tell you down to the hour, how long they had to continue in the classroom to get to their 25, 55. You had to be
that's right.
25 years and 55 years of age. But look, having said that, 55 isn't too old, right? I mean, I really hadn't thought about this in writing the report, but that should have been one of the strategies: is hire 56-year-olds.
Oh, there's no question. We have to go after the, nearing that edge and being in a place where you could say, you know what, I'm okay now, and I can do this.
No, I've got my pension, and now I'm going to put myself for the next 10 years in a more satisfying intellectual environment. That would be. It's funny. I've been saying for a while now, if I were half my age, I'd be moving to an ESA state and trying to open a low cost private school, core knowledge classical school. Maybe I'm selling myself short. Maybe I should do it anyway.
Maybe you should. Listen, Robert, before we conclude, you're a good journalist. I mean, you did it for 20 years at Time, at Business Week, and so forth. So you know how to get to the sources. As you look at the report that you just generated with your team, were there any sources there that either surprised you or you'd recommend to our audience? Like, check this out because this is really good information.
Well, I mean, I'm a sucker for frontline practitioners, right? I mean, I don't want to criticize my colleagues in the ed policy world, especially those who sign my paychecks. But I think those of us who write about schools, especially if we're, ed policy people, we do tend to worship to excess at the altar of the researcher and the policymaker as opposed to the practitioner. I mean, I'm indulging my bias here, Rob, but I've said this for a while, that for the ed reform movement, setting aside the classical component of it, but for the sake of 55 million, American school children, if we really are serious about improving their outcomes, then we need to be more focused on practice, not policy, informed by research. I don't want to sound dismissive of research. Give me the veteran teacher, give me the veteran, school leader. Those are the folks that I want to talk to. Those are the folks that I learn from.
Yeah. And you had plenty of them quoted in the report. And I think our work here at the Commons is definitely about trying to take those anecdotes, those stories, those lives, and put them forward as evidence, right?
And by the way, may I also say that when I, am interested in something on classical education, the very first person I call is a guy by the name of Rob Jackson. So
you flatter me, Robert, and I appreciate that. I really do.
It's true, right? I mean, how many conversations have we had about this over the years?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
we're going to keep chipping away at it.
You were my Boswell. My wrong classical illusion. Who was the figure in Dante who leads?
Virgil.
Virgil. You were my Virgil.
That's right. Oh my goodness. All right. High praise. Robert, thank you so much for spending some time with us. This is great. We're going to have you back, and we're going to talk about that ideal grad program that will really deepen the teacher's knowledge, content mastery, true pedagogy, real pedagogy, and all the rest of it. Okay. So that's later. We'll try that in a couple more months. Thanks for the good work you're doing. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Virgil.
Join us weekly on the Classical Commons podcast for updates on this renaissance in classical liberal arts education, and subscribe to our podcast here, and you'll see people like Robert. Thanks, Robert.
See you.